Oh, yeah. Okay. So I'm going to discuss the 44th federal election that occurred on September the 20th, 2021. And essentially, we had results which, before 2021, mirrored very much a minority government, which means that no one party in the House of Commons had enough seats to govern by itself. And the Liberal Party, which is the governing party, was held up by the New Democratic Party, the Bloc Québécois. And without one of those two parties, the Liberals could not have governed. The Conservative Party of Canada was the official opposition, and the Green Party of Canada held 3 seats. And there were 3 independents. Now, the big issue is, why did we have an election? It had only been 2 years into the last one in 2019. And the Prime Minister, Mr. Trudeau, claimed that he needed it in order to move forward with a post-pandemic agenda. He said Canadians need to register whether or not they felt they were supportive of the direction the government was going. And many people, of course, argued that the only reason he was doing this was because many other provincial governments in Canada had elections and were successful. And so he was being a bit of an opportunist at that time. So the ballot question, no one really understood why we were having the election, but it went ahead and it was a 36-day election, which is really normal in Canada. We then had, what are the issues? Well, from the start, it's how do you manage the pandemic coming out, particularly the cost of the pandemic? And so again, this was the big issue for Canadians to grapple with. Was the execution during the 18 months of the pandemic the right way to go? But again, from the start, the Liberals stumbled out of the gate. There was a memo that indicated that, in fact, that they really didn't have a comprehensive approach going forward, which was embarrassing. By the end of the first week, the Liberals were on the defensive. In an election, when you are the governing party, being on the defensive is never a good thing. So during the issues that came up, we have the NDP. The NDP are traditionally the third party in Canada. They're more of a socialist party headed by Jasmeet Singh. And again, the Liberal lead that they had initially when the election started evaporated. The NDP had a popular leader, but their problem traditionally is they weren't able to explain how they would pay for a lot of their grandiose programs that they had put forward. People liked their programs, say on housing, but they couldn't really explain how they would pay for it. Never a good thing. Opportunism. Again, we had fixed election dates, but the Prime Minister can at any time ask the Governor General to dissolve Parliament and hold an election. You need 170 seats in order to have a majority government. That is not to worry about having the support of any other party out of 338 members. Said before, many provincial governments had won during the pandemic, and this seemed to be, at least in the eyes of Mr. Trudeau, an opportunity to cash in on that. Electorates normally during crisis don't throw government out because there's an uncertain period, they need stability, and usually governments are returned. Well, again, the government had argued, hoped that they get the sympathy of Canadians. It was the summertime. Canadians like to be out. They're traveling, they're at their cottage, they're doing barbecues. They're not really paying attention to the election. And most people, which is true, viewed the election as really not starting till after Labor Day. That's when people would start to look at things. And again, this would be an election that when it went ahead, maybe some people were angry. Maybe some people said, well, we don't want to spend $620 million. We don't understand what the issue is. And therefore, they might punish the government. The Liberal Party, the governing party, from the beginning gambled again that incumbent governments would be elected. Again, they stumbled out of the gate, and people concluded that really there wasn't much difference in Conservatives and the Liberals as the program, the election started. And the Liberals lost their lead at the end of August. The New Democratic Party, as I said, continued to attack the government during the election. Again, the leader was popular. Many people were disillusioned. Many people who are center-left in Canada vacillate between the NDP and the Liberals, which are a little left to center. But again, the NDP tends to make proposals without really the financial details. Conservatives, the official opposition, went in with a new leader, a man named Mr. O'Toole. And Aaron O'Toole tried to bring the party, which is traditionally on the right of the political spectrum, more to the center. All the votes, majority of votes in Canada, as in many countries, are in the center. They're not on the fringe of the right or of the left. And he tried to bring them in. Now, some members of his party were not happy that he was changing policies that seemed to be sort of pseudo-liberal by bringing in friendly policies towards the working class, climate change, etc. He even suggested that on the carbon tax that the Liberals have, that he might implement that as well. So he had two problems. He had to convince his own party members that what he was doing by bringing the party to the center was the right thing to do. And at the same time, he had to convince Canadians who traditionally saw the Conservatives on the right of the spectrum that he wasn't just talking, that he was going to actually deliver based on what he said. So that was a two-front problem for Mr. O'Toole. Then there was the People's Party of Canada. And the People's Party of Canada, I will talk about in a moment, siphoned votes off from the Conservatives, and I'll explain why. There was also a provincial issue here, and that was Premier Jason Kenney of the province of Alberta in Western Canada. And he had alienated a lot of people because initially Mr. Kenney had supported Mr. O'Toole. People in Alberta were not very happy, but they were also not very happy with Mr. Kenney because he had opened up the province too quickly in the view of many people, and particularly medical experts, during the COVID period. And the rates of infection soared in the province of Alberta. That was a big problem. And the failure of Mr. Kenney was then linked to Mr. O'Toole. And the Liberals used that very effectively by saying that they were both the same, and that essentially the Conservatives didn't have a clear plan on the pandemic. Clearly, Mr. Kenney didn't have a plan, and what he did have hurt Albertans. That gave rise, of course, to the People's Party of Canada, headed by a former Conservative minister, former industry minister, foreign affairs minister named Maxime Bernier. Mr. Bernier had run for the leadership against Mr. O'Toole for the Conservatives, and he lost on the last ballot. There were 13 ballots, and incredibly, on the 13th ballot, he'd led all the way, then he lost. He was obviously very unhappy, and he took many of his supporters with him. He appealed to many of the people in the country, although there's less than 20%, who were fed up with lockdowns, who were fed up with wearing masks, who were fed up with vaccines, all of those things. But he also pushed for lower immigration to about 100,000 a year rather than around 300,000. He was a fiscal conservative. He actually wanted to eliminate the deficit in Canada, which the Liberals had originally under Mr. Chrétien done back in the late 90s. And he wanted to end multiculturalism. So he attracted a whole swath of people, not just people on the right, conservatives, but disenchanted Liberals who were fiscally conservative. The NDP, people who, again, were unhappy with the NDP, went to his party. So he hurt a lot of conservative candidates in many ridings because he took conservatives with him. The party soared from 1.6% of the vote in the previous election in 2019 over 5%, which was quite significant. Then we had the Green Party of Canada, headed by a new leader, Annemiek Paul. Unfortunately for Annemiek Paul, the parties, when they formed a firing squad, they formed a circle. They shot themselves in the back, in the front, in the side, just a disaster. And she never was able to recover. A lot of people didn't like the fact that she had been elected leader. They only ran 250 candidates out of a total of 338. They didn't even have a full slate of candidates across the country. One of their Green members, originally had 3, as you know, in 2019, defected to the Liberals. Didn't help her. and they had fiscal problems. And in fact, the party even restricted the amount of money that could be spent in the election for her. So she barely left her own riding where she was running as a candidate, which she eventually lost. And so the Greens from the very beginning were handicapped. And their popular vote fell to 2%. The election results were mirrored, essentially, it was back to square one. There was very little difference. So again, we spent $620 million and people said, why? Because nothing really changed. The seat count, the Liberals had 160 seats. There's again with the official opposition, the Bloc and the NDP were elected, and the Greens with 2. Now, as we do not have proportional representation, that is, so many votes, you get so many seats, the PPC, Mr. Bernier did not elect any members of Parliament, including Mr. Bernier himself. The Conservatives received more votes than the Liberals, but that doesn't matter in our system. It's the number. Do not elect a government. There's a fallacy out there. We don't elect governments, we elect parliaments. Out of Parliament, the party with the most seats, one who gets to claim government and see if they can put a government together. So the results essentially back to square one, no difference. Here we are. Again, everything seemed to be pretty well the same. And $620 million later, people are saying, so what happened? What are the messages of this election? Well, Canadians want their political leaders to deal with the issues that really matter. If we had not spent that money, we could have probably done a lot in the interim. We wasted essentially 36 days. The more leadership and less politics in Parliament. Parliament has become I spent 14 years in Parliament, and Parliament has now become very toxic. There is little, shall we say, love among the parties in terms of somebody proposes something, they automatically say, no, we don't agree with you, instead of trying to look at collaboration. The economy, now we see inflation is rising, employment issues with many stores, businesses looking for work, people who have been out of work or were getting government assistance during the pandemic period have been slow to get back into the workforce. Inflation is a major issue, as I said, and of course the government has to avoid any future lockdown. The number of people in this country who are being vaccinated, close to 90%, 1 shot, and over 80% with 2 shots, which of course is very helpful. We need to have an economic strategy. We've been spending money hand over fist, and unfortunately, no end in sight. So again, at some point, we're going to have to pay for that. Parliament needs to be convened as early as possible. Well, the Prime Minister just announced his cabinet on Tuesday, and Parliament still will not meet until November 22nd. That is a problem because during the election, he said he needed a mandate and he needed Parliament to act. Well, Parliament is not acting because Parliament's not going to sit now until November 20th. So again, we elect parliaments, not governments. Individual candidates need to be better vetted. We had a number of issues during the election where candidates had issues that came to the fore. Some of them had to drop out, which is a problem. Political parties have far too much power in this country, and leaders have far too much power. Leaders can actually determine who can run and who cannot run, which, from my perspective, is completely ludicrous because, again, we are electing members of Parliament, and together they have a lot of authority, but they don't use it. We need to empower those members. They need to be there not just to vote, but actually do real work. That we're talking again on the member of Parliament side, the House of Commons. This does not obviously deal with the Senate because, of course, it's unelected. So we had political opportunism, which is always risky and very painful at times. We had parties of negativism, division, which is never good in any society. Attack ads, do they have effect on voters? Some do, some don't. But there was no national vision in this election. What was the real issue? And essentially, the media tends to concentrate on leaders rather than on policies. And that's obviously an issue. I've gone through that fairly quickly, but during the Q&A, I'm sure, Julie, I'll be able to answer any questions. And thank you for your attention.